Uh, one of the greatest concerns in our spiritual life right now, because it kept being mentioned in Sabbath school that we are in the last days. We're seeing the signs. Um, there's things going on politically and in the environment. You know, uh, like natural disasters that we witness, and and growing up Seventh Day Adventist, I always had this narrative in my mind, that we're going to be persecuted for keeping the Sabbath, and there's going to be trials and tribulations, and that we're supposed to be ready for that, right? And I think that greatest concern of our spiritual life is, will you stay faithful to the end? Will you stay faithful to the end? And I think a lot of us wonder that, when we think about the trials and tribulations, we wonder, do we have the strength? When I talk to my other Christian friends that are not Adventists, some of them believe in the rapture, that they'll get taken before the tribulations, then we won't have to go through that. But they're kind of on the line about whether, like, what will they experience as Christians. But we have those same conversations, like, do you have the strength? Do you have the strength of will, right? Or like, we imagine scenarios of being taken captive and being tortured so that we renounce our faith. Do you have the pain tolerance that it takes to stick to your faith, to not renounce Jesus Christ, and go through that experience, go through that tribulation? So that's the kind of things that you think about. Those are so the two things that we imagine when we think about trials and tribulations is strength of will and pain tolerance. Strength of will is that which involves, like when you're driving on a road and you're kind of thirsty, and you could either get a water or get a soda, all right? And I guess your strength of will be the one that says, take the water, like, that's the measure of your strength of will, right? And pain tolerance, like, I don't know, like, I guess when you wake up in the morning and it really hurts to get up, but you have to, so, or maybe you're trying to take a cold shower and you're expecting that. Well, I mean, there's worse pain than that, but from our day-to-day lives, I think that's the worst pain that we experience, getting up in the morning, if you're not a morning person. And let's see, what in our day-to-day lives, what else do we experience as pain? I guess when we're craving, because we don't get hungry in the U.S., we don't get hungry, but we experience pain, I guess, when we're craving a food and we're not getting it right away, right? So, so those are the types of scenarios that we tend to imagine when we think of trials and tribulations. We think of being tortured. Do we have the pain tolerance to handle that? Or being excluded from society and not being able to buy or sell. So that falls into like conviction, or maybe even being tempted to break the Sabbath. So that's strength of will, right? And those are the stories that stand out. Those are the narratives that stand out. But Satan is not a simple brute. We have to keep that in mind. Satan is not a simple brute most of the time. And in Genesis, you'll see this, and we kind of talked about this, right? That Satan is clever, He gets you off guard. He catches you off guard. So when the trials come, it's not just going to be a straightforward battle about can you do it or can you not, Can you handle it or can you not? There's going to be little tricks involved. And an example of this is in Genesis. Genesis says that the serpent was crafty. It describes the serpent as crafty, cunning. And even in some cultures, they use the serpent as a symbol to represent wisdom. Because they can think, they can trick. They can trick you. And with a nemesis, with an enemy as cunning as the serpent, you can be sure that the battle will not simply involve brute force, will not simply involve strength of will, will not simply involve pain tolerance. And we wouldn't be doing any justice to the craftiness of the serpent if you didn't take strategy into account, if you didn't take lies into account, if you didn't take craftiness into account. Eve, you have to remember that Eve did not fall into temptation, not because she didn't resist enough. The Bible doesn't say this, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, but the scenario wasn't just simply, oh, I want the fruit, I must resist. There was none of this resistance, straight resistance of not eating the fruit. Do you hear that? So she didn't fall into temptation because of that. Instead, she was tricked. And in another example, Jesus did not pass the trials in the wilderness. Jesus went through trials in the wilderness. Jesus did not pass the trials in the wilderness just through sheer strength of will. And there was strength of will involved. Fasting for 40 days, that's a long time. You got to have strength of will for that. But there was more than that. There was a lot more than that. If you read the very few temptations that he went through, the very few temptations that are accounted in the Bible, out of the many that he went through, if you read about them, they involved kind of like trickiness, right? Satan was telling him the truth. The enemy was telling him the truth, but he was telling him the truth in a sort of way and implying something else, and trying to get him through sly implications. So, if this is why we need Christ, first of all, let me just mention that. We do not have the strength of will, nor the pain tolerance, nor the ability, nor the discernment to be able to go through all of Satan's deceptions, all of Satan's tests. We need Christ. We need Christ. And we have to hold on to that. That is our only hope. But that's still so we're not trying to get through the trials to go to heaven, to have salvation. We're going through the trials, and we want to pass them because we're saved. We have to keep that in mind. That's the first thing I want to make clear. We are already saved through Christ, and it is not by our strength, it is not by our cunning that we're going to have salvation. So keep that in mind as I say everything else. But the trials, the things that we're going to be tested on, is not just it won't just be a game of persistence. You're not being tested on how much you want salvation. It's not just passion. Your passion for Christ will not be enough. Your emotion, how much you want it, that will not be enough. Whether you want it enough or not. Because if you think about it, everybody wants salvation. Everybody wants salvation. Whether they know it or not, they all want it. They all want to be saved. They all want to get out. They all want something better. Right? And if salvation was just based on desire, that would be enough. But we know that it's not. There's going to be people that are lost, that want salvation, and that are going to be lost. But mental clarity, knowing your values, faith, discernment, besides strength of will, besides pain tolerance, you also need this mental clarity. You'll have to look into your own heart to confront the weaknesses in your faith. Know where your faith is lacking, evaluate your values, and make your decision to stay faithful. So, for example, if you have a problem with eating unhealthy, right? If you have a problem with eating unhealthy foods, you have to analyze yourself and say, why am I eating this? Because I have this craving. Okay, so what's important to me? Is satisfying this discomfort, is that more important to me? Or is following a strict regimen? Or do I even see this as something bad? It's only a little bit, right? So it's not like I'm hurting myself too much. So I'm in an okay level. Like I'm not too unhealthy, so I'm good. So you have to evaluate your values, see what you really think about yourself. Why are you doing it? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you better? Why are you keeping yourself in this situation? Kind of go through that whole process of analyzing your values and analyzing why you do what you do in order to be able to change it, right? So staying faithful through weakness and failures. So right now we're analyzing staying faithful through the trials. And we're going to look at staying faithful through weakness and failures, staying faithful through abandonment, when the rest of the people around you, they abandon the faith, staying faithful through discouragement, and staying faithful through disillusionment. And we'll analyze those closely. So, staying faithful through unworthiness, failures, and there's many examples in the Bible of people that became unworthy, right? We have David when he sinned with Bathsheba, and we have King Saul, right? When he kept disobeying God. But they both responded differently to their unworthiness, right? David took the punishment. He accepted the punishment. Saul had no choice but to take the punishment. And I guess neither did David. You know, they both received punishment. But Saul kind of gave into the pain. He gave into the unworthiness. He counted himself as unworthy, and he couldn't go anymore. He couldn't go on any longer. David, on the other hand, once he took the punishment, he said, "You know what? God's will is done. Let it be the way it is. I'm unworthy. I've done this bad deed. I've done this bad deed. Let's just continue. Let's see how we can move on from this." So, faithfulness through unworthiness. But the two main examples that we see in the Bible that I want to point out is Peter and Judas. They both failed. They both renounced their faith. They both felt unworthy. They both failed and felt unworthy to face Jesus. They both felt unworthy to continue with the ministry, to continue with their ambitions of the ministry. Both Peter and Judas. But what was the difference there? Satan led them to feel unworthy. One of them succumbed to the pressure. And if you look at Peter, he felt unworthy. I'm pretty sure at that point, when Jesus was getting crucified, when Jesus got crucified, all the disciples felt unworthy. All the disciples felt unworthy to share the gospel. But what would happen if they would have given into that unworthiness? They said, "You know what? I'm unworthy to share the gospel. I'm just not going to do it." And that would have been the end of the ministry. And it seems like such a clear choice, you know, like what's better, to share the gospel or to not share the gospel? It's obviously better to share the gospel, right? That's what we have to do. And sometimes the choice is that clear, but when you insert unworthiness into the equation, when your mind is fogged up by that feeling of unworthiness, you know what is right. Sometimes a blessing is given to you. Sometimes somebody gives you a gift, you know, out of the goodness of their heart, whether you don't even deserve it or not, but because you feel unworthy to take that gift, even though it's the better choice, you still don't take it because you feel like you don't deserve it. And sometimes we do that to ourselves. We know the better choice, but we don't make it because we feel like we belong in the worst situation. Can you stay faithful through the unworthiness? Can you accept salvation regardless of how bad you've messed up? Isn't that interesting? Now, and to kind of show you why this happens, for example, there are those that feel like they don't deserve salvation, and they're right. They don't deserve salvation. None of us do. And you should never think that you deserve salvation. If you ever depend on the idea that you're a good person, somebody's going to tell you the truth. Satan in particular. So this is one of the few times when Satan comes around and actually tells you the truth, right? He tells you you're unworthy, you don't deserve salvation. He doesn't remind you of Jesus. He doesn't remind you of all that stuff. He just wants you to give up. He wants you to give up your blessing, right? Satan will come around and show you the truth. But the reason why this happens is you condemn yourself. You condemn yourself for your own values, right? So let's say there's a rich man. There's a rich man, and a rich man condemns poor people. A rich man that hates. Imagine a scenario where there's a rich man and he doesn't like poor people because they don't contribute to society, because like maybe he thinks they're in that situation maybe out of their own deeds or maybe by chance, but for whatever reason he doesn't care about them. He doesn't help them out. He thinks they should get themselves out, and or they deserve to be there for one reason or another. And so imagine a rich person that treats the poor like that. One day he goes through a bad business deal or maybe a series of events, but he ends up being poor. How do you think he feels about himself now that he's poor? Because he used to condemn, because he used to judge those that were in poverty. Now that he's in poverty, now he judges himself. Because he didn't forgive the poor, because he didn't have any compassion for the poor. Now that he's in that same situation, he doesn't have any compassion for himself. I mean, he can't, or else he would be going against his own values. He would be going against his own beliefs. He either has to switch out those values, he either has to give up his own beliefs, or he has to condemn himself. Those are his two choices. But you have to realize that if you're ever in that situation, Jesus himself does not condemn you. Jesus does not condemn the poor. He does not condemn the weak. He does not condemn the sinner. He didn't condemn the prostitute. He didn't condemn the thief on the cross. He does not condemn you. He does not lose hope in you. He does not condemn the terrorist, nor the pedophile, nor the serial killer, nor the drug addict. And that's a good thing. That is a very good thing, that he doesn't condemn these people. Because you can count on the fact that if you ever happen to be in these situations, if you ever happen to be a serial killer, if you ever happen to get this bad, if you ever happen to be somebody who's terrible, who just has no compassion, who only looks out for himself, who does these terrible things, if you ever happen to be in these situations, you can still have faith that Jesus does not condemn you, that Jesus still has his hand held out to you. But the important thing to remember is that regardless of how much you hate yourself, regardless of how much you condemn yourself, Jesus does not condemn you. He prompts you to change. He does. But he does not condemn you. And he gives you a chance. And also keep in mind that if God waits until the very end, the very end of our history as human beings, God waits until the very end to make his judgment on all of us. He waits until the end, until the wheat and the tares mature, to decide, okay, this is what's going to happen. If God himself, in all his wisdom, waits until the very end, why are you so hasty to judge yourself? Why are you so hasty to condemn yourself as unworthy? Why are you so hasty to judge others? So that's the first one. unworthiness? Can you stay faithful through unworthiness? Remember that your unworthiness means nothing. You are unworthy, yes. But God is greater than your unworthiness. Faithfulness through failure. And this is the reason why I was in Vegas, where I met Winston, is because I went to a couple of business conventions, right? And there was a time when you had to buy the tickets, and so there's kind of a time when you buy the tickets and then you assign names to the tickets, right? And because in this particular convention, we don't usually do this, but there is we had invited George W. Bush as a speaker, so he was a guest speaker at the convention, and because of that, like it kind of complicated things a bit, high security and all that stuff. So it turned out that you had a deadline to assign names to the tickets. A deadline that was like 3 days before, and I didn't know about this deadline. Eventually, I found out about the deadline, and so I was like, okay, we're good. Well, I'll just do it. I had VBS that week. I was participating in VBS, so I said, okay, well, I have to do this VBS thing. The deadline is on midnight. The deadline is midnight. I'll just do this VBS, and I'll have I'll take care of everything here, and I'll have 2 hours left to assign names to the tickets. I'm fine. So I'm done with VBS, and then my friend calls me up and they said, oh, it was just mentioned that the VBS was moved back even further. The deadline was actually 9 o'clock. You've missed the deadline. You can no longer assign names to the tickets. I was like, man, wow, okay, well, you know what? I mean, I guess I lost my chance. But I don't know how the system works. This is what went through my mind. I don't know how the system works. I don't know how they made this decision. I don't know what's going on here. So what I'm just gonna do is I'm just gonna try to assign names to the tickets. If it happens, good. If it doesn't, then I guess it didn't work out. But I mean, even though it was already declared that I had failed, that I had missed my chance, I still moved forward, just in the off chance that it might not be true, right? And so I went ahead. I went onto the website. I searched my emails and I assigned names to the tickets, and it worked. So I was like, okay, it worked. The tickets were reassigned, but it did happen after the deadline. So I was thinking, okay, well maybe, okay, so I reassigned the names, but maybe because it happened after the deadline, maybe they won't accept it. Maybe, who knows? But they were accepted, so that's a good thing. Another example, when we got to the convention, I was carpooling with my friends to go to Vegas. And we were planning to go before a certain time so we could get there in time for registration, right? So we got there, and a lot of people kept coming back from the registration place saying, you know what, they closed registration early. So I was like, okay, well maybe, my typical mentality is to know what, double check, confirm, but there was just a lot of people saying the same thing, right? I was tempted to go there myself and talk to somebody and say, okay, and confirm for myself, Eventually, but I didn't do that because there was a lot of people, and we could have just registered the next morning. It wouldn't have been too bad of a consequence. But we would have to wait. So what happened is that eventually we met people that were saying, oh no, registration is still open, you could just go. So I was like, oh, that figures. We only had 15 minutes left at the time, but we got there and we got in. But if you think about these situations, right? The only reason why you would fail to move forward is because you think that you already failed, right? And that is one of the ways that Satan tries to trick you. Sometimes the only thing that you need, if you have somebody opposing you, just by making them believe that they already failed, that they already missed their deadline, that they won't be able to do something, maybe that you convince them that you looked into the future and that they get no reward for whatever they want, that belief, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm sure you've heard that term. But the belief that you've already failed will lead you to fail. And Satan in his cunning will use that. He will make you believe that you're already lost. He will make you believe that there is no hope for you. He will make you believe that judgment is already closed. He will make you believe that you have the mark of the beast and that there's no way to take it off. But this is where the true self comes out. Have you heard that line that says, integrity is what you do when nobody's looking at you? I'm sure you've heard that line before, right? I want to say something along those lines and say, who you really are comes out when you've already failed, taking this into account. When you've already failed, that's when your true self comes out. What would you do? How would you act if there was no hope of salvation for you? If there was no reason for you to accept Christ, if there was no reason for you to be a Christian and follow Christ, if there was no reward at the end, what would you do in that situation? How would you act? Imagine this scenario. Imagine you've received the mark of the beast. Imagine that judgment is already closed. What would you do? What will be your decision? And whatever you do there, that's your true self. And depending on your answer, if your answer is good, if your answer is, still follow Christ, then you can count on the fact that you will be faithful until the very end. But if it's something else, then that's something that you need to take care of. But Satan will tell you that there is no hope. And he will use that to his advantage. So you have to make sure that you're faithful even through the idea that you've already failed. Remember, be faithful through unworthiness, through your feelings of unworthiness, and be faithful through your failing. Faithful though others leave you. And we have examples of this like Noah. Pretty much Noah and his family were the only ones that were saved in the flood. Elijah, when all the priests had gone to Baal, to follow Baal. So the examples of Noah and Elijah were examples of people that went against all odds. They went against the odds. When everybody left, when everybody else had differing opinion, they held their convictions. And just to give an example, there are those that choose a church based on the people that are in it. And they only go to church. There are people that only go to church just because of the relationships that they have in the church. Or they only have a relationship with God because of the relationship they have with others. But if your relationship with God, if the only reason why you go to church is because of the people in it, what's going to happen to you when all those people are gone? And I just want to tell a random story of a little girl. So picture this little girl, and she likes to visit the neighbors, and the neighbors live on a hill. So the neighbors live on a hill, and there's this little girl, and she likes to visit, right? And every time she visited the neighbors, they would take really good care of her. They would be nice to her. They would let her play with their child, and they would play games. They would watch movies. They would eat snacks. They'd have them over for dinner sometimes. And eventually, after a while, the neighbors they found a very good deal to buy a mansion somewhere else, and they moved out. They moved out of the house on the hill and they moved to a mansion, right? And so the neighbors moved out to a bigger house with more rooms to play hide and seek, with all types of technological gizmos that they had installed in their mansion, with a pool and a huge backyard. Maybe they had animals. And the neighbors kept inviting the little girl. But But the little girl never went, right? And so they asked her, why don't you come over and visit us anymore? You don't like us anymore? And the little girl says, as innocent as she is, she says, genuinely and straightforward, and with a smile, she says, no, I only went to the hill to see the sunset. And now that you guys moved out, I can finally go in peace to the hill and actually see the sunset instead of being distracted by all the stuff that you guys are inviting me to do. Right? So, why are you in church? Why do you come to church? Is it because of all the things that we do here? Is it because of the people here? Or is there something more important than all of that? Is there something more important here that you want to see? When everybody leaves the church and you're still here, when everybody leaves the faith and you're still here, they'll wonder, why is he still going there? When all the priests left to follow Baal, and Elijah was still faithful, and everybody was wondering, why is he still there? I mean, he doesn't get the protection of the king as a priest of Baal. He doesn't get the blessing of the king. There's no benefit in following the Lord. There's no benefit in following God, in following Yahweh. Why is he still following that? But could it be that Elijah was after something more important than what they were after? Elijah wasn't after relationships. He was seeking something higher than that. And they got to see that at the little competition they had on Mount Carmel. So, could it be that you're here for a more important reason? Now, that said, yes, it is important for people of the church to be welcoming. It is important for you guys to welcome the visitors. But your decision to choose a church, that should be your duty. It shouldn't be a requirement for you. You should require it of yourself to be a good person in the church, to be welcoming. When you go to a church, you should aspire to be like that, not to require it of others. You are not here for the nice people. You are here to be a nice person. You're here for God, and to follow his example, to love like he does. Faithfulness through discouragement. So I read The Desire of Ages recently. And one of the features that really stood out to me about the way Ellen White tells a story is that the events told in the gospel were the infancy of Christianity, not the infancy, the conception of Christianity. So those were the very beginnings of Christianity. This great Christian phenomenon that we have today, Christianity is all over the world. The story in the Gospels were the very conception of it. Those were the beginnings. And it's so easy to read the stories right now, to read the Gospels, and to read Desire of Ages, and read about the disciples and the apostles and say, just have faith. I mean, look how Christianity, like you almost feel like you want to talk to the disciples back then and say, just have faith. Look at how big Christianity is today. Christ's ministry will succeed. Don't worry, disciples. We have Christian churches all over the place. We have the Jesus fish on almost every car. We have crosses. You can't go anywhere without seeing a cross along the way. You have many Christian denominations. You have a lot to choose from. You have the Catholic Church, they're a global organization as well. Don't worry, disciples. Christ, the Christ story will get out there. You can tell them that from this point of view. But the apostles did not have the same evidence of success that we do today. They had no idea that Christ was going to be such a big hit in the world. If only Judas was there to see all of this. When the disciples were on the boats in the middle of the storm, they had no idea that they were not going to die. To them, if they died right there, that would have been the end of the ministry. That's it, story over. They had no idea. They were scared for their lives. When Jesus was being crucified, to them that was the end of the Messiah. When Jesus was being crucified, that was the death of any hope of redemption. That was the end of the story. Seeing Jesus die on the cross, that was the end of Christ's ministry. If you put yourself in that situation, you want to bring Christ to the world, and now everything that you hope for is being condemned to die. To them, that was the end. That was the end of being a disciple. There was no more to do. Satan, at that point, what they saw was Satan succeeding in drowning out the light of the world. Hopelessness. No wonder the disciples were so distraught. No wonder Peter denied him. There was no point in following. No wonder Judas committed suicide. To him, it was a choice between death or death. There was nothing left. And I think that we don't give the disciples enough credit for the trials they had to endure. Imagine, what if somebody told you, what if not somebody told you, what if you saw with your own eyes the death of God? Imagine the moment we've all been waiting for, right? The second coming. The second coming of Christ in all his glory. Imagine that enshrouded in darkness. Enshrouded in the darkness of the dragon. What if you saw New Jerusalem being invaded by Satan and his forces? What if you saw the world around you won over by corruption? What if you saw yourself being taken and labeled as property of the Satanic kingdom? And yet, this is what the disciples saw on that day. This is what the disciples saw on the day of their master's crucifixion. The moment they've been waiting for. They were expecting salvation, and they got the very opposite. They got the condemnation of the world. An unbelievable sight. Let the stars fall, let the sky roll up like a scroll, let the elements of the world be burnt up. Nothing matters now. Would you still hold on to your faith if you saw Christ himself turn to dust in that second coming? And I'm sure Satan, in all his tricks, he can make us see that. But can you still be faithful through that? Can you still be faithful through the discouragement, the disillusionment? Would you still hold on to your faith if you were absolutely certain there was no reward? No heaven, no eternal life, New Jerusalem, no God. As I said before, integrity is what you do when nobody sees you, but what do you do when there is no reward? That is your true self. And if your true self is not pure, then you need to confront that. You need to confront that weakness. So, this is all to analyze, to ask yourself this: what does your faithfulness depend on? Does it depend on your worthiness? Does it depend on your successes? Does your faithfulness depend on the validation of others? Does it depend on encouragement? Does it depend on the hype? You know, if there's no hype, you're not happy with your spiritual life. Does your faithfulness depend on evidence? On the evidence that you see that, you know, maybe Christianity is true, that maybe the prophecies are coming to pass. Does it depend on that? Does it depend on miracles? Does your faithfulness depend on the reward that you're promised at the end? Because if it depends on worthiness, you know, Satan could just tell you the truth, you're not worthy. If it depends on your successes, when you lose your successes, when you start having failures, Satan knows where to get you. When you start having failures, you lose them. If your faithfulness depends on others, you will lose your faithfulness when you lose others. Or maybe Satan can just make you think that others are not in the faith, that others have failed. And in turn, that will make you fail. Does it depend on encouragement? What happens when the encouragement is gone? Does it depend on evidence? What happens if somebody turns around that evidence or reinterprets that evidence so that it's no longer viable? Does it depend on the reward? But our goal here and our challenge here is to remain faithful. Remain faithful even if you're not worthy. Remain faithful even if you already failed. Remain faithful even if others disapprove of that. Remain faithful even if you're not encouraged to do so. Remain faithful even if there is no reward. But just remain faithful just because that's the way you are. Christ has to be in your heart. Christ has to be in your DNA. It has to be in your identity. So that no matter what happens, you're still living out the Holy Spirit. Kind of like, an example of this could be like the identity of a fish. The identity of a fish is to be underwater. That's just what a fish does. That's just what a fish is. A fish is not a fish unless it's underwater. If it's anywhere else, its fins have no purpose. Its gills have no function. And it has no life. The identity of the fish is to be underwater. Your identity should be to follow Christ. Just like that. If a fish enters a competition to see if it could hold its breath underwater, try to tell them, well, you know what, you already lost the competition, there's no point of you being in the water anymore. What does the fish do? Is it, I lost the competition. Does he crawl out of the water? No, of course not. He stays in the water because that's just what he does. He wasn't underwater to win the competition. So it doesn't matter if he failed the competition, he's still going to be doing what he does. Pull all of the fish's friends, pull them all out of the water. Do you think the fish will follow along? Well, maybe. I'm not really sure how their brains work, but ideally, no. Or a better example would be no. The fish, more internal instinct is to survive, not to follow his friends, right? So, or tell a fish that it's not cool to be underwater, or that nobody likes being underwater. Being underwater is a passing fad, It's not the hype thing to do. What does the fish? No, the fish stays in the water. Tell the fish that it's not getting paid to be underwater, but it still continues to be there. That same way that a fish does that should be Christ in us. You do so. When you do this, you will not need a reason to live a Christian life. You won't need any type of miracles. You won't need somebody to reward you for being yourself. You'll just be. If somebody tells you that you have failed, that you've already received the mark of the beast, that judgment is already close and that there's no hope for you, you'll just be like, okay, great. I'll just keep following Christ. That's what's in me. If somebody disapproves of you, you'll be like, okay, well, I mean, because you disapprove of me. I mean, there's nothing I can do about that. I'm just me. Christ is in me. That's what I do. That's how I live. If you're not encouraged to live a Christian life, you'll still do it because you don't need to be encouraged. That's just how you are. And even if there's no reward at the end, even if there's no New Jerusalem, you'll still, even if you're condemned to die on the cross and be separated from God, even in that way, you'll be so close to the Holy Spirit that you'll keep carrying that cross. That's the same condemnation that that's what Jesus had to go through. He had to go through the hopelessness of being completely lost. But of course, he had his Father's guidance. And that's how we should be. That's the conviction, and that's the level of conviction that we should have. And as far as the reason for your faithfulness, that should be the reason. It's Christ himself.